My name is Carina Curto. I'm a math professor at Penn State, and I want to talk to you today about a certain model that I think provides a unifying framework for many neuroscience phenomena. So let's get started. So the questions that motivate our work are questions about sequences and more generally attractors and neural networks. And specifically, we are concerned with dynamic attractors, not just static attractors. And these are the ones that these are the ones that can provide a mechanism for generating sequences of activity, central pattern generators, other kinds of rhythms and oscillations. And so this is really the focus. And we want to understand how these dynamic attractors and how sequences emerge from the detailed pattern of connectivity of a network as reflected in the connectivity graph. So this is trying to make a connection to the kinds of data that come out of connectome research. All right. So the model the mathematical model that we use as a setting for most of our work is threshold linear networks. And these are very simple firing rate models of neural dynamics where every neuron has a firing rate that's represented by one of these variables x sub I. And the dynamics, given here on the right, have a leak term, negative x sub I, and a threshold nonlinearity. So the argument inside the brackets, if it is positive, so meaning if the recurrent inputs to the neurons plus some threshold plus external input value b sub I, if that exceeds 0, then you have an identity function. So if you looked down to the right, there is a red threshold linear function. That is the one that the brackets plus is reflecting. So you will get identity function if that's positive, if the argument is positive, and you will get a 0 if it's negative. And we will refer to these dynamics in terms of the W matrix. But we will also pay attention to a more specific model that I'll introduce in a second. So these threshold linear networks, remarkably, can generate all kinds of nonlinear dynamics, including multi-stability, so like multiple stable fixed points or multiple attractors, limit cycles, chaos, and even quasi-periodic attractors. Moreover, all these different kinds of dynamics arise for effectively inhibitory W and for a constant external input. So these networks have been studied a long time in neuroscience, and they've been used to model a really wide variety of dynamic behavior. But I think mathematically, the real push that inspired a lot of the work that we do came from Hong-Lo Sung and others nearly 20 years ago now. They wrote a couple of papers that really kicked off kind of a more serious mathematical study of these networks. And then I followed up with Anda Digerato and Vladimir Itzkov, and then Katie Morrison. And so you can think of these as analogous to the Hopfield model in the sense that they can encode multiple attractors, and in the symmetric case, Hong-Lo Sung and others were able to prove a result that was very much like the Hopfield model, guaranteeing convergence of the attractors, convergence to a stable fixed point in the symmetric case. All right, but we care more about the non-symmetric case, and in particular, we care about stable and unstable fixed points, and here are some references for the papers that I will talk about. Okay, so the motivating question is, again, what is the relationship between the attractors of a network and its underlying architecture? And before I keep going, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge my collaborators on this. So especially Katie Morrison at the top left. She has been really my co-author on basically all this work for the last 5 or 6 years. She's my co-PI on the Brain Grant and is really equal PI to me and everything. Caitlin and Juliana and the other Caitlin and Josh are all current and former graduate students. Chris and Jesse, former postdocs, and Vladimir and Anda, other mathematicians that I've worked with on early parts of this work, and then There are some more names here, other people who have joined in. Okay, so let me get going. Back to the threshold linear networks. We really can think of them as this patchwork of linear systems. So one thing that's really nice about this model of neural network is that we can piggyback off of the considerable knowledge that we have about linear systems of ODEs and kind of patch that together into a nonlinear framework. And one of the sort of first things that you will notice about these networks when you study them is that there's actually a one-to-one correspondence between the fixed points of the network and the allowed supports. So in other words, the fixed points can be labeled by the linear chamber in which they arise. So if you think about these equations, they break up, they partition your state space into a bunch of different chambers because the argument inside the nonlinearity defines hyperplanes. It defines a hyperplane arrangement for you. And so you really end up chopping up the state space into these different linear chambers where you have an honest-to-goodness linear system of differential equations that's governing the dynamics. And in each of those linear chambers, there may or may not be a fixed point. And so the game of figuring out what the fixed points of these networks really is the same as figuring out what chambers contain the fixed point associated to their linear system. Okay, and so you can, with this patchwork of linear systems idea, here's an example of different chambers for a network with just 3 neurons. And you can see here a trajectory starting near an unstable fixed point and spiraling out into a nice limit cycle of behavior. This trajectory actually traverses 4 different chambers. Okay. So, a lot of the research that we've been doing for the BRAIN Initiative has been focused on a special case of threshold linear networks, which are combinatorial threshold linear networks. And this is a special case that's really designed to tackle the question of connectivity specifically. So in these networks, you can start from a graph, just any directed graph, and there is a recipe for how to assign weights to the edges of the network based on this graph. So when there is an edge between 2 nodes, we assign this weight -I plus epsilon. So you can see here the Wij formula down below shows that you have a -1 plus epsilon if j goes to I in the graph. And if there's no edge from j to I, then you have this weight -1 minus delta. And what these 2 values represent are a weaker and a stronger inhibition. So epsilon and delta are positive quantities. And so basically what you have is an inhibitory network where you have 2 kinds of inhibition. You have strong inhibition and weak inhibition. And that pattern of strong and weak inhibition is really what's governing the dynamics. It's really going to shape the attractors. So we can think of this as a generalized winner-take-all network with this pattern of strong and weak inhibition. And for fixed parameters, so fixed choice of epsilon, delta, and theta, which is an external input to the network, the differences in dynamics are purely due to differences in the graph structure. So this really is a way to isolate the role of connectivity in generating in these internally generated dynamics. Okay, so just to give you some examples of dynamics that are generated by these networks, here's one where you have a very simple cyclically symmetric graph on 5 nodes, and it produces a limit cycle attractor that cycles through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can look, the colors in the attractor in the rate curves are matching, of course, the colors in the nodes of the graph, or the neurons. And you can see that you cycle through this nice limit cycle attractor. However, the very same graph produces another attractor, which has very different looking, almost melty rate curves. And we call this one the Gaudí attractor because it reminds me of the architect in Barcelona. So these networks for different graphs can actually exhibit coexistence of many different kinds of attractors. So here's an example of, just draw a graph on 9 neurons and choose an epsilon and delta. And we see here that we actually get 4 different attractors that coexist in this network. So you go from the activity chooses one or the other based purely on initial conditions. So For some initial conditions, you fall into this limit cycle. The black on the top right, the black curve, by the way, is total population activity. You can see that it is remarkably stable, even as the individual neurons oscillate quite a bit. You can have a chaotic attractor below that, which has even more stable total population activity, but lots of switching back and forth on the active neurons. And there are also two stable fixed point attractors. And so, again, these all coexist in the same network. The only difference that leads you to one solution over another is initial conditions. Okay, so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk basically going through applications of two theorems that we were able to prove. So, again, we are mathematicians, and so we've been studying these networks and trying to connect structural properties of the graphs with dynamic properties of the associated networks. So, this first theorem is about subgraphs of uniform integrity. So that means that every node has the same number of incoming and outgoing edges in the graph. And the theorem that we have, although the slide didn't transcribe well, something went off going to the PDF. Apologize for that in the system. But the theorem basically says that if you have one of these as an induced subgraph of a larger network, then that subgraph supports a fixed point if and only if no node outside of it receives d plus 1 or more edges from the nodes in the subgraph. So let me illustrate that with an example. So the corollary is that if G is a cycle, your fixed point corresponding to it survives if and only if no node outside G receives 2 or more edges from G. So what does that really mean? So here's an example graph on the left where you have 5 nodes and you have a couple of 3 cycles embedded in the graph. So 2, 3, 5 is a 3 cycle and 1, 4, 5 is a 3 cycle. Okay, on their own, right, isolated, each of those would produce a limit cycle where the neurons oscillate in that order, 1, 4, 5 or 2, 3, 5. However, embedded in this graph, what you see is a difference in the embedding of the following form. So the 1, 4, 5 cycle actually has a node 2 outside of it that's receiving 2 edges from nodes in the cycle and therefore has no associated fixed point and no associated attractor. In contrast, the 2, 3, 5 cycle has no such external node receiving 2 or more edges from it. And so you see you have a very nice limit cycle corresponding to that. Okay, so what we have, just to summarize, is a theorem that tells us when certain subgraphs will have surviving unstable fixed points, in this case, and when those unstable fixed points survive, we predict that there will be a corresponding attractor. Okay, so in that sense, the mathematical theorem tells us when we will have certain kinds of attractors. Okay, and we have a similar result, similar corollary. So the theorem was more general. These are corollaries for special cases. Similarly, we can predict stable fixed points from surviving clicks. Okay, so how can we use this in modeling? So one very nice model that we can make using the ideas of this theorem is a simple counter. So if you take a bunch of 2 clicks, like we have here at the top, and connect them in this way, and you have arrows going forward from 1 2 click to the next, it turns out that all of these 2 clicks will have surviving stable fixed points. And so this TLN network has 6 stable fixed points, 1 per 2 click. However, if you give a pulse to the, so if you, depending on initial conditions, you'll go to one fixed point or another. But if you start, for instance, at the blue, the light blue, dark blue fixed point, and you give a pulse to the whole network, so you can see down below, we have this pulse train. This global pulse to the whole network will actually kick the activity over into the next stable fixed point. So it'll go from, say, blue to green, and then from green to pink and red, and so on. And so this, based on the theoretical results, we're able to design an extremely simple counter network that will keep track of how many pulses have come in based on the attractor that the network is in, where every pulse bumps you over. Okay. And keep in mind, these are global pulses. They are not targeting specific fixed points. It's just like it's moving it over every time. And we can have similarly a signed counter where you can have left and right pulses. The left pulses would stimulate the bottom row of neurons. The right pulses would stimulate the top row of neurons. And similarly, you can have then the activity moving left or right in this network, depending on pulses coming from the left or the right. And so, for instance, when you have these experiments where an animal is running down a corridor and counting cues on the left versus on the right, this is a simple network that would keep track of the net sign, the net number of left minus right cues. Okay, and then we have another, this is kind of a fun TLN roulette, which is if you get rid of some of the edges, you can get the activity to spin around and kind of stop on a random 2-click. Okay, so let me give another example. If you think about place cell coding in the hippocampus, one thing that's very interesting is when you zoom in and look within a cycle of the theta oscillation, you actually see neurons firing in sequence, not at stable fixed points. So this again suggests that maybe periodic or dynamic attractors can be a good model for position in this context. And so again, using that same theorem we talked about before, but now applying it to this more complicated graph, we have a nice rule graphically knowing when the fixed point will survive and then predicting when the attractor will survive. And so we can come up with what I call a continuous, in quotes, attractor network, because it's not really a continuum of attractors, but it is a sort of a discrete family of many attractors that are all of the same type. So there's this modularity to the structure of the network. And what you see with a network like this is, from the mathematical theory, we can predict that we will have limit cycles for each of these pentagonal subnetworks. And stimulation can move you from one to another. And moreover, you can have a situation where a global stimulation, where you're hitting sort of all of these red nodes, one per attractor. So the stimulus doesn't, know where the position is, doesn't know where you are. It's just hitting the whole network at once, and it's always the same. So these identical theta pulses that are hitting, this distributed set of red nodes will, again, like in the counter case, move you from one attractor to the next. This is another mechanism by which you can have position tracking in a sort of more complex network, where internally the attractors are not fixed points this time, but they are sequential, right? So they are dynamic attractors where the neurons are firing in sequence. Okay, and you can even add some noise to the matrix, and you can see that the noise can cause some failures of transitions, but overall it's quite robust. And so again, you have kind of these global theta pulses that can move you from one attractor to the next, even though the external pulse knows nothing about the current position of the network activity within the family of attractors. Okay, and finally, maybe I'll just take a few more minutes to talk about one more theorem, which is about cyclic unions. So it turns out there are many theorems that we have where we can predict the fixed points of a network that is generated by gluing together smaller networks. Okay, and so in this case, the structure is a cyclic union. So you have smaller networks, tau 1, tau 2, etc. I'm not showing the connections within those, but then they're glued together in the cyclic fashion, having all the edges going forward from one component to the next, but none of the back edges. And in this setup, we have this nice theorem that tells us that the fixed points of the larger network are basically unions of fixed point supports of the component networks. So in other words, if you know the fixed points for the individual components, you can work out the fixed points for the whole network in a very simple way. And this is an example of actually doing that. So it's a little complicated slide, but this is really showing that from working out the fixed points of these individual small networks and the blobs, we can figure out all the fixed points for the entire network in 2 examples. Okay, so I'll end with an application of this, and that is to central pattern generator circuits. And in this case, my student Juliana worked out a central pattern generator circuit for quadruped gaits. So these are the familiar, like for a horse, walk, trot, gallop, bound, pace. I'm not sure the horse does pronk, but these are all familiar quadruped gaits. So these are locomotive patterns of motion. And what we found, or what Juliana found, was that she could create, using cyclic unions, networks that generated activity for each of these gaits. So here's a network that does bound. So the neurons representing the legs of the horse or the animal are 1, 2, 3, and 4. So left front, left back, and right back. Those are the four legs for the quadruped motion. And this is a cyclic union architecture. And using this, she was able to create the bound gate using another cyclic union that still involved those same 4 nodes, but some other different auxiliary nodes. She was able to create pace. And so you can see down at the bottom right the pattern of activity of when those legs hit the ground, right? And so you can see these different patterns. They actually, if you trace back to what the different gaits are, they match up with what you would expect for these gaits. So this is one for trot, this is one for walk, okay, and finally for pronk. And so the point was that she was able to design, using cyclic unions, individual networks that individually created all of these gaits, but of course there are these same 4 neurons involved, 1, 2, 3, and 4, for the different legs, okay? So the question then was, can we put these together in a single network where all 5 of these gaits would coexist, okay, and be accessible via different initial conditions without having to change any other parameters? And what Juliana found was that, yes, you could actually do this. So she was able to sort of really just glue together, take sort of the union of all the edges from each of these different networks that she constructed for the gaits. And it's a simple, this is not fine-tuned at all. These are standard choices of epsilon and delta. These are the 2 parameters for making the W matrix from the graph. If you remember, there is a recipe for going from the graph to this W matrix. And down here at the bottom left is the adjacency matrix for kind of this giant graph. But it's really, if you think about it, a very simple graph that's just obtained by gluing together the graphs for the individual gaits. And so it has 24 neurons, and here's the matrix for it. And remarkably, this graph with all of these individual limits, all of these individual cyclic unions glued together, actually produces all 5 of the gaits. Okay, and it's not hard to find initial conditions for each gate because you really just need to stimulate one of the neurons that is sort of unique to that gate. So there are overlapping neurons for the 5 gates, but then there are neurons that only appear in one gate. So if you stimulate one of those neurons, you actually end up in the appropriate gate. And I just want to emphasize one more time, the only difference here is initial conditions. So in fact, this means that you could transition from one gate to another by kicking the network, which effectively, resets the initial condition to a different part of the state space. So here's an example where you started in the bound gate. So there's some pattern of activity of the feet hitting the ground, of the legs hitting the ground for the bound gate, and then a little kick. So this is one neuron, neuron 15, which is one of the unique neurons to pace, got stimulated here, and that kicked the activity from bound into pace. You can see there's a different pattern of activity. In the pink rectangle here, this is the focus on the 4 neurons that are actually determining the gait, the 4 neurons for the legs. And then another stimulation, neuron 19, which is unique to walk, kicks you into the walk gait, and then neuron 23 kicks you into pronk, neuron 17 kicks you into trot. And so here we see that not only do these gates coexist in the same network, but it's very easy to transition between them just by stimulating single neurons that, that will activate the different gates. And so this gives you a very clean mechanism by which a central pattern generator circuit, a single central pattern generator circuit can encode multiple gates. And this is we're very excited to see this because in the literature on these types of models, usually one has to change parameters to go from one gate to another. And so this, having the attractors truly coexist without any parameter changes, exact same connectivity matrix, is, we think, is a new discovery that this can be done. And then we've added also noise to the W matrix to see that there's some robustness here in the architecture. 1% noise in the W matrix didn't alter the dynamics at all. 5% noise, and we did see a transition failure from between some of the gates in this last transition. So it does break down at some point. And I think I want to end there. So I'll just show my collaborators again. And thank you very much for attending my virtual talk.